Now we're going to move ahead to our next presentation, who will be Mark Bayer, founder of Bayer Strategic Consulting, a Washington, D.C.-based firm that focuses on helping scientists, engineers, and technical professionals master the keys for successfully interacting with policymakers and other influential stakeholders. His presentation, Lost in Translation, How to Manage Multiple Stakeholders and Communicate Research Effectively in an Era of Competing Facts, will highlight proven and actionable stakeholder management techniques, including how to segment stakeholders into similar categories, surface interests of each segment, and develop suitable, productive engagement approaches. Mark, are you ready to go?
I am ready to go, Joanne. How are you?
Good.
Can everybody hear me okay? I just wanted to respond first, just very briefly, to a comment that Dr. Bowen made in response to the last question she was asked relating to relationships with policymakers, and just wholeheartedly agree with Dr. Bowen's response as somebody who was sort of born and bred in the policymaking world. The emphasis on relationships really cannot be emphasized, or I should say, cannot be mentioned and reinforced too much. So that was exactly what I would say if asked about how to craft messages and interact with policymakers. I tell people not to just make requests of policymakers, but to build relationships with them. So this is exactly the right tone for policymakers specifically. So strategic and intentional, I should say, involvement of stakeholders is, a vital activity within the research enterprise. Everyone listening appreciate that and be tuned into that. Otherwise, they probably would have skipped this. But understanding and accepting that fact is only the beginning, of course, because the varied interests and perspectives and degrees of influence of entities and individuals, all who sort of can have a say in accelerating or supporting or thwarting or delaying research, can really create a challenging landscape that can be difficult to navigate. So what I want to focus on are what are the critical success factors for effectively communicating and interacting with key stakeholders, and which pitfalls should be avoided. How can select stakeholders among the constellation of individuals who could influence your research or your work, how can they be enlisted to combat misperceptions that could undermine support for the work that you're doing? As Joanne noted, the aim of my presentation is to show you proven and actionable stakeholder management techniques, how to segment stakeholders into similar categories, basically try to figure out what's motivating, what are the interests of each of the segments that you've created, and then how can you develop suitable, productive engagement approaches that are tailored towards these specific categories. So we have a lot of interesting, I would suggest, topics to cover, and I want to make sure that we leave time for plenty for questions. But this is the roadmap. This is where we're going. Sort of what are the particular ingredients that you should be thinking about? If you say, well, I accept the premise that engagement is important, what are the ingredients to actually create effective engagement? Why you should do it with a very specific example from my own experience, and we'll get to who I am in a moment. How you make your way through that landscape, avoiding problems, landmines, things that could derail you, and taking channels and routes that are most productive. And what are sort of some of the, boiling it down, sort of what are some of the successful stakeholder kind of keys to engagement? And then what are some of the major problems that I've seen throughout my career? And we're also going to include a case study which, appropriately enough, builds on one of the last comments that one of our reactors made at the end of Dr. Bowen's presentation with respect to cancer patients. So I spent 20 years on Capitol Hill in two different, actually, tours right out of college and then later in my career, all told about 20 years. You can see I was Chief of Staff in the Senate and House of Representatives, and then as well as that, did other work in the private sector and in the nonprofit sector. And then since leaving the Hill, I've been focusing on helping scientists navigate this challenging environment, I would say, with respect to facts and a denigration of expertise, which I'm sure many of you have experienced firsthand. And this is just a small sample of some of the work that I've been doing. When I sort of teach, what I try to do is bring together my experience in the government, the corporate, and the nonprofit world. And there are distinct features, obviously, in each of these sectors, but I've seen after spending time in each of them that there are absolutely similarities across sectors, and there are really touchstones that you bump up against or you notice within each sector. And so the skills that I'm wanting to share with you today are certainly portable, regardless of your professional environment. So, from the bench to the boardroom and beyond, the skills and abilities that I want to talk about today are really designed to boost your effectiveness, whichever specific career path that you happen to be in. Okay, so this first part, just some of the things to keep in mind to really focus on when you're talking about how to be a powerful person engaging in this kind of, with stakeholders and within your environment where you have various interests, all with different motivations and perspectives and points of view. So, I want to just start with what productive engagement I submit looks like, in general, before we move on to sort of why it's important as part of the research process. Engagement is really not an appendage. It's not a bolt-on in the IT world. It's something that should be done by design. It should be baked in, we used to say, in the policy realm. It's not an afterthought. And actually, it's an asset and not a liability. I think oftentimes when you think about changing practices or altering processes, and you start to get to the root of why things are done the way they are, many times it begins with a mindset. It's attitudes that have been built up over time based on experience or based on values, based on an interpretation of what worked or didn't work in the past. So I like to sort of start talking about kind of like a mindset shift as we explore really what it means to engage powerfully. And part of that begins with the shift to this understanding that engagement is an asset and not a liability. And talked in Dr. Bowen's presentation talking about many times this is a requirement now for funding. Of course, there are ways of complying and doing the minimum with requirements, and there are ways of doing a bona fide embrace of the requirement. And I would submit that the latter, is the one that is much, much more productive. I have a question also. Sort of the first question that I'll be asking. I'll be asking a few questions throughout the presentation. If engagement is so beneficial, I sort of laid this out, and I expect that the audience believes that engagement is important and is an asset. If it's so beneficial, why do you find that some scientists, colleagues, researchers, fall into the non-productive behaviors on the right side, of the graphic? Why do you think it can be a challenge for researchers and others to be unproductive, to approach this as kind of a requirement and try to get around it in a sense, not necessarily as an opportunity, but more as a liability? What are the causes of that? If you want to type in the chat, I would be interested in getting your take on, why that is. It's funny. I was part of a panel in June over the summer up at Cornell, which is actually where I went to undergrad. It was a panel that was put together to talk about SciComm, science communication. And one of the scientists there said that she was hesitant to engage because she was afraid that advocates, patients, for example, in this situation, the patients would ask her a question about her work, and she would not know the answer, and they would be very angry with her. So she sort of retreated in general when she was talking with patients or to lay audiences into more of a technical, very cautious, dense way of speaking and vocabulary to, in many ways, kind of frustrate that interaction because she was afraid that, she would get a question that she wouldn't know the answer to. I asked her if that had ever happened, and she sort of laughed and said, no, but it could, which is true. Theoretically, if someone's going to ask you a question, you might know the answer, but that can be the beginning of a dialogue and not a comment on expertise. If you did experience that, by the way, if you sort of were in a situation where you got asked a question by a patient, for example, how you didn't know the answer, how did you deal with it? How did you respond to a question or a comment that you really didn't know the answer to? I would be interested in knowing that as well. So looking at beginning sort of this mindset shift that engagement's an opportunity and not an obligation per se. And it's not just a nice to have, but it's actually a need to have. These are talked about previously as well, and I think that you're familiar with sort of some of these benefits that have been talked about before. And I guess one other sort of another question that I'd like to ask in this situation, it kind of goes towards another benefit of incorporating patients as advocates as part of an effective engagement strategy. Has anyone been confronted by the falsehoods, total inaccuracies about their research? And how did you respond to them if you did? I'm curious about that, and I think the reason will become clear as we move a little bit further into the presentation. But I'm very curious. We talked about sort of competing facts as within the scope of this presentation. And it's sort of like, have any of you been in a situation where you were putting forward information and you were getting pushback from others who weren't basing their statements on evidence or fact or any sort of, either reliable or verifiable source? And then if you had that situation, how did you deal with it? This goes another sort of point on why it's so important to have patients or say lay individuals as part of your coalition, as part of your why should you engage with sort of these populations, is it really helps identify what I call research champions. And this is so important when you're talking about advocacy with policymakers. Again, coming at it from my perspective, how I've seen worked very closely with scientists both throughout the state of Massachusetts, which is my home state, and then all across the country as part of my work, both on the Hill and then with AAAS and March for Science and others. I've seen how having champions who are actually, whether they're experiencing the condition or they've been affected by circumstances that your research is intended to either analyze or ameliorate, the reaction that policymakers, whether that's members of Congress, staff members, regulators, that sort of reaction, those comments are very powerful, and in many ways they can be more powerful than a graph or data based on a double-blind study. something like that. It's that element of engagement that I think advocates who are actually experiencing the circumstance that you're working on, that's really an important role for those advocates who are so situated. Really telling personal stories about the importance of the research funding is sort of hitting a different, I would say, dimension of persuasion in discussions with stakeholders that is extremely powerful. In many ways, it can be even more powerful than the data, depending on the audience. I also think, why this engagement with stakeholders is so critical. It really helps you test and you hone your messages with lay audiences. I mean, you kind of can move out of the echo chamber that is your colleagues and some, I don't mean echo chamber as they're going to agree with you on everything, but I mean echo chamber in the sense that you're sort of all broadcasting on the same frequency. You have sort of the same set of norms and understandings and relative, education and so forth. And there are sort of just certain norms that everybody understands. But when you take your message sort of on the road and you get out of your own circle and you start to make the case about the importance of your research with funders or with policymakers, people who aren't familiar with the technical details, it really would be great to have had sort of what I would call a focus group, a focus group before you show your research. I mean, the studios do this all the time, right, with their movies. I mean, they have screenings and they have questionnaires and they're trying to get feedback from a subset of consumer who may see their movie before they finalize it. And if you can sort of look for opportunities to do that with lay audiences, if you're going to be going out, and making the case of the importance of funding, continued funding, for example, or new funding for your research, if you can do that, you're at a tremendous advantage if you can do that before you actually take your show on the road, as it were. And you can respond accordingly, right? I mean, this goes to the this relationship building, meaning to have a group kind of, or various groups that you have pre-existing relationships with, where you have sort of a dual a dialogue and not just broadcast, right? Where people are feeling that you do incorporate and respond to feedback as well as provide information. You kind of have that at the ready, and so you build sort of a community and start putting together sort of your focus group that you have, so you can consult with those folks before you expand your message to those outside of your immediate professional circle. And as a result, you can get you get tips. Don't say that, don't put it this way, express it that way, or you forgot this, or that was misrepresented, or so forth. Advocates can review posters, they can give feedback, and so forth. So it sort of takes us to a case study that comes from my work on the Hill. So the Communications Act, when it was first put on the books, when radio, TV, it's been updated obviously many, many times over the years, but the Communications Act was still sort of operating in a very much sort of like in a manner that was not providing the degree of accessibility to people who are blind or people who are deaf. So if the iPhone, satellite TV, wireless, set-top boxes, in many cases, those interfaces were just not required to be accessible to people who are blind, people who are deaf. And I worked very closely in 2010 on an overhaul of the sections of the Communications Act that dealt with accessibility. And our idea essentially was to do an ADA, an Americans with Disabilities Act, for the electronic world, for the communications space. And so we talked a lot about on-ramps to the internet. We've taken care of ramps into buildings and so forth. We need to take care of ramps to the internet. We need to make sure that communication devices and services and the whole universe of things that we take for granted, we need to make sure that they are accessible to people who are blind or people who are deaf, because they're essentially utilities. They're kind of required equipment in today's world for purposes of work and social and entertainment and so forth. So one of the things that we were very careful to do, I should just say, taking a quick step back, that this is an extremely, as you would imagine, extremely technical, engineering-focused area. I mean, every interest group that you could think of, from Netflix to the Motion Picture Association of America to Apple, Samsung, all the handset makers, all, the Consumer Electronics Association of America, everybody was concerned that mandates put into this update would affect them and require them to, do certain things with respect to engineering that were counter to either what they wanted to do or what their engineers told them was the best way to deliver a product or service. And so there was a legion of folks from an alphabet soup of industry, electronic industries, including various associations of companies and then the companies themselves, who were intently interested in what was going on, which is all to the good, but I'm sort of just describing what the general environment looked like. And so we would make cases, on policy grounds, and we could talk about, the need for this. But it was much more credible and much more powerful when individuals who were actually affected would speak up and talk about what this would mean for them. Clearly, they were part of the constellation of stakeholders. So we work very closely with the American Federation of the Blind, the National Federation of the Blind, the National Association for the Deaf, the Perkins School, which coincidentally happens to be in Watertown, Massachusetts, which was in my then boss's congressional district, now state, as he's a U.S. Senator. It was much more compelling to hear from individuals who were enabled every day to live, without technology being a hindrance, than to have us explain exactly why this was so important. There's a quote from Dr. Joe Hansen that I love to use, which is, your data is not your story. It's a character in your story. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient. And, I also have my own Ecclesiastes of effective communication, which is, every message there is a messenger. And you should figure that out. Maybe it's not you. Maybe it's a patient advocate who's part of one of your sort of focus groups or kitchen cabinets, so to speak, when talking in the kind of political realm. The other thing I just wanted to touch on there is why it's such a benefit is because those individuals, not only do they have a personal stake and can talk in a personal way about it, but they also can talk in a very emotional manner, because it is an emotional topic, what this means for them, what it would mean if these changes were frustrated or not implemented. And that can be a challenging and difficult space for scientists and for researchers. Emotional terrain, it's not fact-based. It's touching upon another chord. And so, that emotion can be in some ways, you can in some ways sort of deputize advocates to deliver those sort of emotional appeals. I talk about who are the CEOs, who are the chief emotion officers in your engagement strategy. And, it's probably not you. It might be, but it doesn't have to be. And particularly, it's not just because it may be difficult, but it's much more credible if you don't yourself have personal experience with an issue, to include a coalition member, a stakeholder who does, as you talk to audiences where his or her views would be, or experiences would be, very relevant. Okay. This sort of just goes, this is essentially what I consider to be a stakeholder assessment. An example of a stakeholder assessment. Trying to understand, okay, who are my who has the power or authority to influence my work? Kind of like a beginning point to ask yourself before you set out to do this engagement. Who are the groups, who are the individuals who could influence the work that I'm doing? And I sometimes call this painting the wall, painting the wall. And I mean that meaning that there's a lot of prep work that goes into painting a wall. As somebody who did that when I was in high school, when there was wallpaper on the wall, when there wasn't, the amount of work that just to get the wall ready for painting, scraping off the glue if there'd been wallpaper, patching the hole, sanding, all of that sort of stuff. And then, you get that, it's about 90% of your work. And then once, you've got your color and you paint it, people look at the wall and say, oh, yeah, that looks great. That color is fantastic. The whole thing looks really great. But what they don't see is all the prep work that you did to get to that point. And that's really what I urge you to think about, is to do this sort of strong research and really come up with an exhaustive list of who could influence the work that you want to do as a starting point. And the good news to tell scientists is that, you're very good at research. You just need to know sort of where to look and what to research, where really to dig for this information. And that's something that is not too complicated once you are exposed to it. So the next question sort of is, all right, great, I did my assessment, and now how do I go about actually, making my way through it? I know the groups, I know the individuals, and now I have to sort of decide, what am I going to do to make the most out of this understanding? I guess what I'm essentially saying is you've got, you have the map because you've looked at it, you've understand sort of where all the landmarks are. I guess it, kind of to stay within the same metaphor, the stakeholders are really the landmarks that you want to visit, whether that's virtually or in person. As you decide, what's my goal? How do I get from here to there? Well, I want to make sure that I check in with and engage with these individual stakeholders who are sort of like your landmarks along the way. You'll find as you come up with an assessment, you can categorize groups. Some groups have similar interests and influence, so that you want to kind of put them in one bucket, so to speak, and they would receive some sort of similar messages if they have similar interests and similar goals. Sometimes people forget kind of about the sequencing. Like I was always very tuned into sort of, who do we want to talk to first? Maybe we should talk to this group first and make our case with this group, because we know that the next group really takes its cues from or is influenced strongly by the previous group. So say, well, when you have the second meeting, it's like, well, we did talk to the American Federation of the Blind about this, and they had some good comments which we're incorporating, and their feedback was very positive. So, you're kind of setting the scene with your follow-on group, and you're giving them a cue that, okay, we understand where your interests may lie. We're kind of citing a group in our coalition now, or a stakeholder that we've engaged that means a lot to you. So to have that good housekeeping seal of approval is important, and that really comes with the sequencing. Thinking about that, and then the validation. Talked a little bit about this before, having your own focus group. So before you even doing the message delivery, you want to think about trying to validate the message that you have with individuals who, carry influence. Like, for example, just to stay within the case study, we worked very closely with the American Federation of the Blind and the National Federation of the Blind, as I pointed out. And but there was certain terminology. We always were referred to people who were blind, people who are deaf. We would never say the blind or the deaf. And that was mainly because, those groups used the terminology, want to use the correct terminology, and that was done to emphasize that these were people. These were people who happened to be blind, or people who happened to be deaf. And, not using that terminology would have been a big mistake, and it would have been seen as, anywhere from insensitive to offensive. And maybe we wouldn't have picked that up if we hadn't been, sort of working with and kind of running by some of our material by these groups. And so that's really important to have on your side, groups that carry influence with other groups that you want to influence. It's not guilt by association, but I like to say it's gilded by association with a trusted stakeholder group. Okay, and these are some of the, I just sort of organize it in the AA, these are the features, these are the traits. Before you even set out, on your engagement journey, you want to know what your goals are, where do you want to go. And, these are just key things you want to pack along with you on your journey. These are really, really important. They're not just, nice things, but actually they're in the self-interest of the researcher, of the scientist, of the proponent of the policy. And they can also, be two-way streets. I mean, active listening shows respect, but it also is an opportunity for you to get information that you might otherwise not pick up that can be incorporated into what you're talking about, into your message. You can refine your message accordingly as you sort of engage actively and actively listen to what people are telling you as you make your journey. This was also something that came up earlier, making sure everyone's sort of on the same page and doesn't feel like, you're a box checker and you don't really want to hear what they have to say, but there's a requirement for the funding that you have a patient advocate as part of your, your team, and so you'll do that. But it's really not bona fide. That's obviously a big mistake. Okay, so as we sort of get to the near the end of the presentation here, I just wanted to mention another sort of case study. So many of you may have heard of the Cancer Resource Center in the Finger Lakes. It does receive some funding from Cornell, which I think I mentioned it's my undergrad institution. I just thought this was a really great fit. It wasn't really about favoritism, mentioning the alma mater, but really in meeting Bob, or talking with Bob Reiter and learning more about the Cancer Resource Center and how they incorporate patients into real partners. And there's an article in Science Magazine, I think it's the October 2017 issue, where the article From Patients to Partners is included, and that link, we can get you that link if that's of interest to you. There are just some from that article and the materials that the Cancer Resource Center makes available, just a couple of quotes that I pulled out that I thought were particularly relevant. And those were quotes, from researchers and students. One said, "We spent all our time in the lab developing an arsenal of experimental techniques. However, in our daily work with Petri dishes and microscopes, we felt that something was missing. We learned all about tumor biology, but we knew very little about the human dimensions of cancer." Another added, "Even though our research is far from the clinic, we believe that interacting with patients and survivors would improve our understanding of cancer and the quality of our science." And, I think it really, the reason I mention that is because it really reinforces this notion that active, effective, bona fide stakeholder engagement is really in your interest. It's really an asset It can also, produce benefits that you may not have anticipated. But there are also sort of tripwires. There are tripwires that you want to be aware of too before you set out on your engagement journey. And I've tried to cover some of the important ones there. If you have questions or you want to follow up with me on the topics we've discussed, I'll leave this slide up. But now I'm interested to hear your reactions and your questions if you have any.
Well, thank you very much, Mark. Now I'm going to hand it over to Donna Matrani for the discussion period. Donna?
Great.
Thank you, Joanne. And thank you, Mark, so much for a fantastic presentation. We'd like to encourage folks, if you have any questions or comments, please utilize the chat pod and we'll have Mark address them. In the meanwhile, while everyone is chiming in via the chat pod, I want us to reintroduce our reactors for the day, Dr. John Kramer, Dr. Deb Rose, and Dr. Sandra Feinstone. So to start us off today, I wanted to ask Dr. Feinstone, can you describe instances where you've experienced the ingredients of effective engagement?
Yes, I'd be happy to. As I mentioned before, the cancer community, I think, has been very effective in integrating the patient experience with at least cancer researchers, and I would say all researchers. But I could give you an example of individual experiences I've had and then a larger kind of real-world experience. I had been doing reviews for the Department of Defense for breast cancer research and was on the shuttle back to the airport, and a researcher who was not in my particular review section sat next to me on the bus, and he said that he was one of those lowly researchers that sits, as Mark mentioned, over his petri dish, but had never met a patient before. He said that he was actually thinking of changing his area of research because he felt so disconnected from it, but just meeting a patient and seeing the possible effect that his research could make in my experience or other cancer patients' experiences was so phenomenal to him that he went back to his lab and was energized. And he and I have continued to exchange emails every once in a while. The other is a partnership with the AAADV, and Mark is probably aware of this organization. It's accelerating and advancing something, drug validation. It's a partnership between academia, pharma, and patient advocates, and industry. So it's wonderful. The interaction there is so encouraging. From a patient perspective, we had thought that industry was sort of the enemy, that they're the ones who keep, don't make or are unable to make treatments available to patients, or that the cost is so high. Anyways, and then because of this interaction, because of this partnership involving patients and talking with academia and how drugs are developed and how they work together, and the FDA is there as well. I'm sorry, I should have mentioned that. It became clear to us as patients how important these partnerships are, the importance that what we could add to the process, and it's been very enhancing. I will share one more thing with you, and then I'll give it to my other colleagues. I just attended a meeting, and one of the presenters is a woman with metastatic breast cancer, and she is on an oral medication. Most of us think that this is a huge advancement in the cancer world, transitioning from intravenous treatment to oral treatment, how much better it is to be able to take a tablet every day as opposed to going in every week or every 3 weeks for an infusion. It turns out that because the way our system is, she's on Medicare, by the way, how our system is, that oral medications are not paid for. They're not paid for in the same way. If she was on intravenous drugs, her treatment would be paid for. But the fact that it's an oral medication, she and her husband had to sit down and have a discussion about how they were going to pay for this. It's quite expensive. And they decided they're going to put it on credit cards so that when her time comes, they will use her life insurance policy to pay off the credit cards. That's unacceptable. That should not be happening. But in this meeting, pharma was there, academia was there, patients were there, the FDA were there. So all of a sudden this realization is that sometimes what we think are advancements in science have huge impact on patients, things that we've not considered in the past. And so I feel very, very strongly that patients and researchers and administrators and pharma and all of it, and of course legislative, because this has now become a legislative issue, that these discussions are extremely important and extremely impactful.
Thank you so much, Dr. Feinstone. And before we move on to the next reactor question, I wanted to take some questions from our audience. And Mark, this question comes from Annette, and she's asking, did you work with groups who communicated with patients, or did you reach out to patients directly? In other words, how did you get your patient engagement?
That's a great question, and the answer is both ways. Sometimes what would happen is that these groups would bring patients with them, and sometimes we would then follow up and communicate directly with the patients. If you're thinking about policymakers and they're a group or an audience that you really need to address, and thinking about, well, who would have impact with that particular policymaker. Let's just say it's let's take a cancer issue. We've been talking a lot about cancer. And so if you're looking, say, to increase funding at NIH for a particular type of cancer, you could look to members of the committee, which would be the Energy and Commerce Committee and the Appropriations Committee in the House of Representatives, and say, well, okay, I should talk to some of those members, right? And then if you have a chance to sit down with those members or staff, each member of the House represents about 720,000 constituents. So say if we had and those constituents are sort of the VIPs in that member's mind because they decide whether the congressman or congresswoman comes back to Congress in the next 2 years. And so if you could have a patient from that district or from that state, if it's the U.S. Senator, then that would even be doubly powerful. From an advocate's perspective, that's sort of what I recommend. When I was on the other side of the table, and a patient would, make a point, and that patient was from our state or from our district, of course, that carries a lot of weight. So sometimes you need to reach out to individual patients to find ones who sort of fit the profile given who you're trying to influence. And it's not difficult to do that.
Thanks so much, Mark. And on a related note, this question just came in from the audience from Tara, and they're asking, can we discuss compensation for patients for being engaged in research and knowledge translation? So, any sort of thoughts you have on whether or not we should be compensating patient populations when engaging them in research?
Frankly, I don't have any direct experience with that. That being said, I am familiar with a couple of different scenarios. So you could imagine a situation where a drug company would be advocating for a particular type of drug that they manufacture, and they may be looking for patients who could benefit from it. So the drug company can make direct appeals to Congress, come in, have meetings, and so forth. And the drug company can also hire a lobbyist, a lobby firm that has experience and that, or may have relationships with the members of Congress that the drug company wants to influence. So if as part of that sort of coalition, the lobby firm sometimes reaches out to patients. And so, it would sort of make complete sense, and I think it would be reasonable if a patient is basically going to be supporting the lobbyist efforts to move this particular drug approval, say, through the process, then why shouldn't the patient be compensated? I mean, the person sitting to his or her right, is probably the lobbyist, right? Not necessarily requiring those sorts of rates by any stretch, but if you're kind of putting forward, and helping or assisting a lobbyist make these points, then you would have a very reasonable case to say, well, I think I should be compensated as well, at least, expenses at a minimum.
Thank you so
So
much,
this
Mark.
is Sandy.
Oh, please
I'm
go
sorry,
ahead,
do you mind
Sandy.
Yeah, I didn't mean to interject. I will tell you that this is a struggle for patients exactly because of what Mark said. We want our voice to be heard, we want our position to be heard, but we don't want to appear to be influenced in any way by pharma. So some of the ways that we've gone around this is exactly what he said, and that reimbursed for our expenses. So if we go to a lab meeting, at least our travel there will be reimbursed. Or perhaps the researcher can include us when he or she is giving a presentation at a research meeting or symposium so that we could be part of that.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of, and I will share with you that there are other advocates that feel very, very strongly that they should be compensated because it gives them value. Unfortunately, dollars and value are very much together. So, but I did want to share with you that it's something that patients struggle with.
Mm-hmm.
No, thank you, Sandy, and I agree 100% that, even just in my work, I've seen that patient populations, if they're not compensated, they feel somewhat taken advantage of, and that their opinions aren't valued in the way that they should be. Moving on to our next audience question. This one comes from Nasreen. And Mark, this is for you. When trying to understand the ideal strategy for engaging with decision makers, what is the suggested method of engagement strategy validation? Nasreen noted that, focus groups are unlikely to be appropriate. So any thoughts on this?
Let's see. I mean, there are a lot of different ways to go about it. I guess the first thing is just to be clear, when I said focus group, I didn't mean like a formal focus group that has, kind of maybe vetted according to the, pollsters' definition of what a focus group needs to look like. I sort of mean people who have the credibility to speak authoritatively about their own experience, right? Who kind of understand what the audience you're trying to influence kind of is looking for. So I could give you so it can be as simple as, calling on the phone and talking to some people, who find them, who understand the audience better than you do is really what it boils down to. And that audience could be, anywhere. For example, I'll just sort of give you an example. So, I did a workshop at the Optical Society of America. And I had never worked with the Optical Society of America before, but I had a professor who was a member of the Optical Society of America. So I called him and, could have a chat with him about, what are sort of the norms. I don't want to tell them things that they already know, but I don't want to leave out things that could be helpful. It all sort of goes back to this notion of relationship building and networking, so that you have, if you don't know the person to call or whose feedback could be helpful, perhaps you know somebody who does, and it wouldn't be sort of an out-of-the-blue request. Just a way for you to kind of road test your message. That's the overall point here.
Thank you, Mark. And so moving on to our next question, I actually am going to put this one to Dr. Rose. And can you share any real-life examples of successful stakeholder interaction in a research project?
Yes, I'd be happy to share some examples. I think in our school-based practice, working in the public school system, we're supporting a lot of stakeholders who aren't familiar with knowledge use or using evidence-based practice. So transferring that knowledge, for example, recommending an evidence-based, a new intervention for a child in a classroom. There can be a little mismatch of expectations. Teachers have their perspective on the child's goals from an educational standpoint, and parents may have a very different goal or objective in what they want their child to do as far as participation. And while initially it might seem that their goals are kind of exclusive of each other, I think it's really important to help develop the commonality, those shared expectations, and help align those goals together. And I think one of the key things that we have used successfully are those key success factors. And one of those being is acknowledging to every stakeholder that they're the expert in their area. The teacher is the expert in education in the classroom. The parents are experts on their child. And we need that along with all the knowledge that we have from the research to be able to make the intervention appropriate and successful for the child. And that's what we've done several times, especially when teachers are looking at educational goals, parents are looking at very functional goals, and we marry those two together so that the child is successful across all the areas.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rose. And our next question is for Dr. Kramer. And this question is, what do you think of the concept of considering stakeholders as customers?
I think that it's kind of an interesting idea. You know, I think going back to I think it was the organizing the categories, research address interests of each category, calibrate messaging according to the specifics of stakeholder engagement. I think, you know, we do with the RRTC on advancing employment, you know, I think we do those not quite packaged quite in the way that we've talked about here today, but certainly we do those pretty regularly, particularly around calibrating the messaging piece. You know, the findings that we produce around engaging in employment are complex, and they kind of mean different things. You know, they have different implications for different stakeholder segments, you know, and so how do you know, which pieces do you emphasize with different groups? You know, obviously you might not engage with individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities and family members the same way around, you know, policy as you would with, you know, policy leaders. You know, you would still engage with them, but you would think about how to talk about it, maybe not quite as jargony as you know, using more common language, accessible language. I think the one thing that kind of, as I reflected on this question, I thought was interesting is the idea of keeping them as customers. You know, I feel like when you're really doing a good job in engaging a lot of different stakeholders and engaged in effective research, you know, the idea of a customer kind of puts them at a different power level that I'm not sure. I don't know. It's kind of interesting. It's one sense that, you know, they put in the time and, you know, they want to be satisfied with the outcome of the research and the implications. They want to have it be helpful. But they also, if they're really effectively engaged, they're colleagues. You know, they're co-creators of that research. They're co-interpreters of the findings, both for their own stakeholder group, but also other stakeholder groups as well. So I think it's an interesting kind of approach, and I certainly agree with it from an accountability standpoint.
Thank you so much,
Yeah.
Dr. Kramer.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
So there's been a lot of very interesting commentary going on in the chat box. I want to take a few more questions from there. And this one is for you, Mark, from Annalise. And she is asking, how do you convince researchers to really partake in stakeholder engagement when you're not in a position of power to do so?
Well, I think, you know, again, like sort of coming from the strictly political realm, and I also talk about sort of what does that mean. I mean, I'm not talking about partisan politics. I'm basically talking about power relationships and the ability of certain people to influence outcomes or thought patterns and so forth. But I always go back to interest. What's in it for me? And I know that we just talked a little bit about, the notion of, customers or whatever and jargon like that. And I really appreciate Dr. Kramer's comments on that. I guess I would say, though, and it all ties into sort of this mindset shift. I mean, why should I do this? Sort of demonstrate to me why it's important and why it's in my interest to do it. And I think you need to start there. And really, in most interactions, when you're talking to stakeholders, you're just sort of figuring out, what do they value, and how you can address those values and sort of those points. So I think that people do things for a whole host of reasons. But in many cases, what's in common is that there has to be sort of a presentation and an acceptance of the benefit that the, say, researcher could gain from that sort of from engagement. And that it does take a mindset shift, but you can sort of begin to influence that shift by demonstrating why it's a benefit.
Thank you so much. And then our next question, I'm going to put out there to Mark, you as well as our three reactors to comment on. And this comes from Kara. Wondering whether you can comment on the degree to which you would recommend in-person contact for stakeholder engagement versus less personal strategies, for instance, non-face-to-face contact.
Well, just to take the first cut at that, I think both is acceptable. If I were in an ideal situation, what I would recommend, if it's not costly or if it's infeasible completely, but I always sort of like to start with an in-person, and perhaps that can even be done like on Zoom or something, Skype or whatever it is. But a face-to-face is always, I think, best to begin a relationship. And then from there, email and phone can be fine. But I really always like to begin a relationship, whatever sort of we're trying to make something happen and move something, by getting people together or getting a face-to-face.
Thank you, Mark. And wondering if any of our discussants would like to comment on this as well. Again, the benefit of doing in face-to-face stakeholder engagement versus non-face-to-face stakeholder engagement.
So this is Sandy. Obviously, I always have something to say. I think that face-to-face adds to that relationship building. It really does, at least from my perspective. It isn't always necessary. I know the Zoom or what have you, that's better than just verbal communication. For another reason, not just the relationship building, but very, very often things can be misinterpreted if it's written. And if it's spoken, it seems to you get the body movement, you get the tone of what is being said. I think it's extremely valuable, even if it can just be for the initial engagement. At least there is relationship building, and you know that you're talking to a person. So I would highly recommend it somehow for that to happen.
Thank you. And I see that Dr. Kramer chimed in on the audience chat that face-to-face is generally preferable, but even more important is consistency. So Dr. Kramer, I didn't know if you wanted to say a little bit more about that.
Sure. Yeah, I think there's an element to it that is being responsive to what the person kind of desires. In our work, face-to-face isn't always, it isn't always preferable for a lot of reasons related to kind of personal preference, access issues, and kind of things like that. But I think being really receptive to what the stakeholders, your colleagues are wanting, what they need to have a good, effective relationship, I think is really the question. At least from our perspective. But yes, face-to-face, there's hard to kind of, qualify the nonlinear kind of interactions that you get that just can't be kind of transferred over the internet. So. I would agree with that.
Thank you so much. And again, thank you so much for all of the questions from our participants and for the great discussion from our discussants. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Joanne Starks. And thank you again, Mark.
You're welcome. Thank you.